The French Revolution. In this chapter, we will learn about the outbreak of the revolution, the Reign of Terror, and rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution. The French Revolution began in 1789 and lasted until 1794. During this period, French citizens raised and redesigned their country's political landscape, uprooting centuries' political landscape, uprooting centuries old institutions, such as absolute monarchy and the feudal system. Rumors spread that the king would open fire upon the citizens. The society was divided into three estates. First is clergy, second is nobility, and third is big businessmen, merchants, court officials, lawyers, etc., peasants and artisans, small peasants, landless labor, and servants. Some within the third estate were rich, and some were poor. All members of the third estate had to pay taxes to the state, which included a direct tax called taille, and a number of indirect taxes, which were levied on articles of everyday consumption like salt or tobacco. Clergy and nobility were 10% of the population, but possessed 60% of the land. The third estate was 90% of the population, but possessed 40% of the lands. The struggle to survive. The population of France grew, and so did the demand for grain. A group of several hundred people marched towards the eastern part of the city and stormed the fortress prison, the Bastille, where they hoped to find ammunition. The gap between the rich and poor widened. This led to subsistence crises. The growing middle class. The 18th century witnessed the emergence of the middle class in France, who were the change makers from the third estate. This estate was educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. The situation becomes worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. The third estate included professions such as lawyers or administrative officials. They earned their wealth through expanding overseas trade, from manufacture of goods like woolen and silk textiles, and professions as lawyers and administrative officials. These ideas were discussed intensively in salons and coffee houses, and spread among people through books and newspapers. The outbreak of the revolution. The financial condition in France was in a pitiable state. Louis had almost bankrupted France, with a 3 million live debt. When Louis XVI became the King of France in 1774, he inherited a treasury which was empty. Due to rejection, they walked out of declared themselves a National Assembly, and drafted a constitution for France to limit powers of monarch, which was led by Mirabeau and Abbé Sieyès. Due to the power of revolt, Law 16 finally recognized the National Assembly and accepted the constitution. The first and second estates sent 300 representatives each, who were seated in rows facing each other on two sides, while the 600 members of the third estate had to stand at the back. In France, the monarch did not have the power to impose taxes. They had to call a meeting of the Estates General, a political body to which the three estates sent their representatives, to pass proposals for new taxes. The Assembly passed a decree obligation the taxes. On the 4th of August 1789, tithes were abolished, and lands owned by the church were confiscated. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. French constitution was created by the National Assembly. During the French Revolution, France becomes a constitutional monarchy. On the 3rd of September 1791, the National Assembly completed drafting the constitution in 1791. Under the leadership of Mirabeau and Sieyès, Marseillaise became the national anthem of France. Political clubs were formed, and among them, Jacobins became the most successful club. Members of the Jacobin Club included small shopkeepers, artisans, such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants, and daily wage workers. The remaining men and all women were classed as passive citizens, who had no voting rights. The Constitution began with a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. Rights such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before the law were established as natural and inalienable rights. That is, they belonged to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. Louis XVI had signed the constitution, but he entered into a secret negotiation with the King of Russia. Rulers of neighboring countries were worried by the developments of France and made plans to put down their events. The National Assembly voted to declare war against Russia and Austria. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. In 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. Elections were held, and all men of 21 years and above got the right to vote. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. The Reign of Terror, the period from 1793 to 1794, is referred to as the Reign of Terror. All those whom he saw as being enemies of the Republic, ex-noble and clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own party, who did not agree with his method, were arrested, imprisoned. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed. The use of more expensive white flour was forbidden, and all citizens were required to eat equal bread, a loaf made of whole wheat. Equality was practiced through forms of speech, and addressed as citoyen and citoyenne. In July, he was convicted by a court, arrested, and the next day sent to the guillotine. A directory rules France. A new constitution was introduced, which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils, which then appointed a directory, an executive made up of 5 members. The fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle classes of seizing power. Political instability paved the way for a military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte. The directors often clashed with the legislative council, who then sought to dismiss them. Revolution of women. Women were active participants in the events, which brought about changes in French society. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to improve their lives. Women from the Third Estate had to work for a living, and they didn't have access to education or job training. Daughters of nobles of the Third Estate were allowed to study at a convent. Working women also had to care for their families. Their wages were lower than those of men. They demanded equal pay for equal work. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. The abolition of slavery. There was a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Slave trade began in the 17th century. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities like indigo, sugar, tobacco, and coffee. The slaves were bought from local chieftains. This was met by the triangular slaves trade between Europe, Africa, and America. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. The Revolution in everyday life. After the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. One important law that came into effect was the abolition of censorship. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France, from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside, and described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large numbers of people, which was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice. Rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. After the end of Reign of Terror, Directory created political instability. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He conquered neighboring countries, dispossessing dynasties, and created kingdoms by placing his family members there. He saw his role as modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws, such as protection of private property, and uniform system of weight and measure provided by decimal system. Many saw him as liberators, who would bring freedom for the people. But soon his armies came to be viewed as an invading force. He was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Legacy of the French Revolution. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. Colonized people reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. Tipu Sultan and Raja Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. From all these points, now we know about French Revolution.